Who here is familiar with CAI? Anybody? Another couple here. Okay. So I thought I'd go kind of high-level overview of who we are, what we do, resources we provide for the industry, again, from homeowner all the way up to business partner with our vendors, community managers, HOA board members, through and through. So, all right. So CAI, we are a 501c6 not-for-profit trade association, incorporated back in the late 70s. In fact, it's a little in here is our 50th anniversary at the national level. We're in growth mode. We grew 3.4% last year. There are 64 chapters across the U.S. I'm sorry, across the world. Forget about Canada and Dubai. South Africa. 60 in the U.S., 4 in Texas, Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, and San Antonio. In the state of Texas, we represent about 3,000 members, give or take on a day. In the San Antonio market, which covers San Antonio, Corpus Christi, and McAllen, we have roughly 375 members in our chapter. Membership category, if you're familiar with CAI, you know this. If you're not, I thought I'd cover it real quick. We really have 3 main categories: community managers, management companies. That's one. Community association volunteer leaders, which is what we call our homeowner leaders, and business partners, which are the vendors that support the community. There's also another segment of just your average homeowner. It's so small it didn't register on the screen, so I thought I'd leave it off for now. Quick fact. All right, so does anybody have a wild guess as to how many HOAs there are in Texas? Anyone got a number? $1 million. 4,026. You must know this. 21,600 community associations in Texas, serving 6.1 million Texans. That's a big number, and it's going to continue to grow. I think that the latest stat I saw is 80 to 85% of all new communities being developed in Texas have some sort of HOA component to it. So the industry is significant, it's growing, and it's here for the foreseeable future. Just about 204,000 Texans serve as volunteer leaders in the community association each year. That's a lot of pro bono time. I don't know if Ray, you're giving that much away, but probably not. But when we assign a dollar value at minimum wage, we estimate that homeowner leaders like yourselves are given about $220 million a year in complimentary work or service to your community and your homeowners in your community. So that's significant as well. A lot of volunteer hours that go into running an HOA. Texans living in the community associations pay nearly $10 billion a year. Anybody here living in the gated community? Well, if you did, you would know that everything behind the gate, sidewalk, lighting, paving for the streets, trash, it's all your responsibility. So if you're ready to pick up a hurricane or tornado, so there's a lot of relief that HOAs provide for local government. That's a key component of what we do. This is all from our Community Association Research Foundation. We've got a million different data points. But I just wanted to cover this real quick. It's obvious. Sometimes we look at it as the Karens of the world, or not in a great light. But what do homeowners really think of their HOAs? 89% of residents in a community association are treated as positive or neutral. Sometimes it's that 11% that gets the most coverage. Certainly a happy HOA member. Probably not going to get picked up in the news media. It's not as sexy as the title as the lady feeding reduction of feasibility get foreclosed on. By the way, 74% of residents oppose additional regulation of community associations. I would say that's probably 90 or 95% in Texas, based on these last 2 sessions, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then 68% say their association will protect and enhance the property value. On average in Texas, a home selling in an HOA is about 4% more valuable than a non-HOA, the one across the street. Ways to get involved. Is anyone here have a hobby or you're part of an association? Yeah, there's an association for everything. That's insane. Automobile association, apartment associations, basket associations. It doesn't matter. So we all operate on kind of the same pillars, which are education, networking, and advocacy. So from our perspective, we do things like education lunch workshops, virtual and in person. We have publications, newsletters. We like to have a lot of fun too. So we do trade shows. We have one on August 11th in San Antonio, the Norris Conference Center. Golf tournaments, fixtures, all kinds of fun things like that. And then our core pillar is advocacy. So we operate through our Texas Legislative Action Committee, which is our advocacy unit for HOAs in Texas. It's comprised of what we call delegates from all 4 chapters across the state. About 30, and then we have another 20 community members that help support. So I should have said from the beginning, we're a member-driven organization, and without, not like we're totally not fun, we got a lot to do. But without your input, those of you who are members here, or constituents who maybe work through a management company or self-managed, we need to hear from you. And I'll tell you a little bit about how you can do that here in a second to help really craft our legislative agenda. This past session, we had a great session. The session before was not so great, depending on how you look at it from our perspective. A lot of changes happened. Are you going to talk about 66 feet? No? Okay. 2 hours before the veto deadline, the governor vetoed our big piece of legislation, which is like a compromise between the realtors, HOA, builders, and some other groups. So it was unfortunate, but hopefully that can pick up in another special session.
Real quick, I do want to make a point. Many of you probably have heard of chicken legislation. Maybe, yes, has not. Essentially, there were probably 5 bills, maybe 6 bills out there that would have done away with citizens and residents like yourself in deciding whether or not you wanted to chicken. As we sit today, you all can get together in your individual communities
just some resources we have available. We've got all kinds of things. I'm not going to go through everything. The only one I want to point out is the HOA hotline. Anyone here ever had an issue with the HOA? Nobody? No hands are raised? I thought I could. There's a resource out there for you. It's the HOA hotline. There's a card back there. It's got a QR code. You can go to our website and click on the HOA hotline. That's a group comprised of community managers with the highest industry designations that we can. About 20 there. You can call and ask anything you want to ask about, or if you need clarity or guidance. It's as close to legal advice as you'll get for having to call someone like Brady. Very kind of thing. It's fair. So please use it as a resource. Share it. Send it out, because the goal of that is really to keep negative news stories out of news and really help provide that guidance for homeowners who may be feeling frustrated with the process. So we encourage you to do that. Lastly, if anyone wants to get involved, ways to do that. Follow us on social media. We're on all the platforms that I share links to, so it's probably not practical. Great. Thank you. See you around.
Okay, let's get a check on our time here, 10:30. We've tried to separate this into 3 segments, about 45 minutes with about 15 minutes of questions, but I'm fine with taking questions on the fly, but I will kind of try to keep us moving. I do have a lot of slides here, but I definitely want you to get the most benefit out of this. So I'm known for talking off the slides, telling stories, and sometimes your stories help everybody in the room. So a little bit about the credentials that I have, and the message here is more along the lines of letting you know how specialized this area of the law is. And that's significant not just for the legal counsel that you may work with, but also with the management company that you may work with, or if you are a self-managed HOA, the challenges that you may face with regard to just trying to keep up with everything. We just spouted off in a few minutes some pieces of legislation and that we were talking about could affect this industry. Every 2 years now, there's some changes out there, and what I have found in my experience is not every self-managed HOA is even aware of changes that are even a decade old by now. So the message here is the significance of the specialization. I'm board certified in 2 different areas, both residential real estate law and property owners association law, HOA law, condo law. It's all kind of falls in with property owners association law. Our Texas Supreme Court decided in 2017 that this was such a highly specialized area of law that they created a board certification category. So like doctors or physicians, surgeons can get specialized in certain areas. The same concept exists for lawyers too. So here's our overview. We'll go through your governing documents and just kind of a hierarchy, what you usually see in your governing document folder or binder, and some of the things you have to have, some of the things maybe you should or could have that would work or benefit your community. An intro to contracts, definitely want you to stay awake through today, so I don't want to dive too deeply into contracts. I'll keep it very scratch the surface, but just give you enough to know what the important parts are with regard to contracts. And then finally, for the volunteer directors in the room, how to satisfy the standard of care, how to preserve your volunteer immunity, and how to preserve insurability. Directors are volunteers. I know how much you all get paid. Again, thank you for taking even more time of your free time to educate yourselves, but there's certain barriers or guardrails that exist for directors that will make sure that even if you are sued as an individual, which does happen in today's world, we make sure that you are immune from that lawsuit as an individual and that you have the appropriate insurance coverage. So governing documents intro. This is really the beginning of the hierarchy. The plat That's really the first restriction that touches your dirt. Before a plat, it's raw acreage. It's a pasture, cow field, whatever it may be. It's just raw acreage. The plat itself turns that raw acreage into a subdivision. Lots, easements, right-of-ways, parks, detention ponds, drainage easements, whatever the case may be for your particular community. But it's an often overlooked document in the file. And I mean, I can hazard a guess that probably none of you received your plat as part of your closing process. I know I didn't. I had to specifically ask for it. But this is what I do every day, so I knew to ask for it. But it is a publicly recorded document. It is available. But that's really sometimes where I go as legal counsel to answer some questions. Who's supposed to maintain this easement area? Who's responsible for this detention pond? Do we have an easement for the sign up front because somebody wants to move that sign because it's on their individual lot? The starting point for me is your plat. From there, the articles of incorporation or the certificate of formation. Conceptually, it's the same document. It's just under Texas law, our lawmakers decided to change the title. So if your community's a little bit older, you're going to have articles of incorporation. If it's newer, it'll be called certificate of formation. That's the document that breathes life into the corporate entity that is your HOA. It's often overlooked as well because it tends to be looked at as a basic document with not much substance to it. But I think it's important, notably, not just because it gives birth to the entity, but because it defines the purpose of the entity. And it's usually pretty broad, and it's usually something along the lines of preserving and protecting property values by enforcement or enforcing compliance with the terms of the Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. Something along those lines. But it's a great place to start, especially as a director, because I like to go back to, when anything that I do, this is just something I do. What is our mission? What is our purpose? Why are we here? Form that foundational idea and then build upon that. Most organizations now have a mission statement. So you can think of the purpose of your organization as a mission statement. And it's good to kind of remind yourselves as directors of that, and sometimes it's good to remind your members of that as well. So the Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. These are your deed restrictions, the covenants. They actually touch the dirt. I hear a lot of people say bylaws. They kind of get misnomers here. They say our bylaws say that you can't run a business from your property. It's probably not accurate. The DCCNRs or the Declaration probably says that you can't run a business from your property, but bylaws and declarations often get the name switched around. You may see supplements to the DCCNRs, or you may see an annexation document that's bringing additional pieces of property into the jurisdiction of the association. And when I say touches the dirt, the idea there is to get you thinking about the house, the lot. The Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, just visualize the house and the dirt, because that's the document that usually says what you can and can't do with the property, what are the exterior requirements, what are the minimum square footages, can you park a car in your front yard, can you park on the street. All of that is going to be in your DCCNRs usually, or that's where it begins. Moving on to your bylaws. Your bylaws really govern how the corporation will function. You heard me talk about the certificate of formation that creates the entity. Now the bylaws will really dictate how that entity operates. How many directors are you going to have? When is your annual meeting? What's your quorum requirement? What does it take to call a special meeting? What is the election process, and what are the methods of voting? It's all corporate, corporate, corporate. So when you think of the bylaws, visualize the entity, the corporation, and that will help you separate the terms there and not call the covenants the bylaws, because the bylaws really dictate how the corporation and the board should be operating. And then rules, regulations, policies, and guidelines. That's kind of the general catch-all. And you may not have all of these in your association. They're not necessarily right or make sense for every association. But I will cover some of the ones that are required by law. If you're a mandatory HOA, membership is required when you buy into the community and you have an assessment obligation. You have to have a document retention policy. How long are you going to keep documents, and which documents are you going to keep for how long? Document production. There's a very specific process for producing documentation, books and records of the corporate entity, and how that's paid for, and how you ask, or how a member asks for it, and then the timeline for the production of those documents. That's another have to under the law. And you have to have a document retention policy, document production policy. It's statutorily driven. It's not a whole lot of magic to it in terms of making the policy look like what the statute says, but just know that you have to have them under the law.
And where do we find that? So that's located in our DCCR section? Is it titled document retention policy, or how do we know if we have that or if there's one?
Good question. So the question is, how do we know if we have a document retention policy or any of those policies, and is it possibly in our DCC&Rs? Usually, and I don't want to sound like I'm giving you a lawyer answer, but I've seen it different ways. Usually these policies are separate than your DCC&Rs. They're either in what could be called a community manual that has several policies within it, or it could be recorded individually. Document retention policy, document production policy.
So it wouldn't be in our menu, it would be at the beginning of when our DCCRs were established and our bylaws. It's all like 2004 is when our community was built, like it should be in documents for 2004.
Not exactly. The law changed in 2011 regarding these policies. So if you're a 2004 community, these policies would likely not exist in your initial governing document package. But 2012, I think, is when that legislation became effective. From 2012 on, you should see these policies of record somehow in your governing documents file. Okay. Okay.
Taking notes here, thank you.
Yes, required by law. Everything I'll cover here. Yes, sir. Great question. So when these documents are created, do they exist somewhere where they will be public record? The answer is they should. They have to under the law. There's a statute in Chapter 202 of the Property Code that requires any governing document to be recorded in the county in which the subdivision exists. If your subdivision happens to split two counties, then that policy has to be recorded in both counties. Yes, sir. Right. So each association must have its own policy. The management company cannot adopt one policy that affects all of its associations. Good question. I'll continue with what's required as well. A payment plan policy, or what they call an alternative payment schedule policy. So if someone can't pay their assessments on time, the law requires that the association give them at least one shot at a payment plan in accordance with a payment plan policy anywhere from 3 months to 18 months to pay off that assessment. And that policy must be recorded in public record. Additionally, the management certificate. So I don't want the name of this document to fool you. Even if you are a self-managed HOA, you will have to have a management certificate. That's just what the statute refers to it as. And you can think about the management certificate from the perspective of it being a document that tells the general public how to find your community and how to find the point of contact for your community, how to find out where the governing documents are for a particular community. There was a big push by the Texas Association of Realtors for this concept because many closings were happening, and buyer representatives were having trouble figuring out who do I need to call with this HOA to get governing documents, to get a payoff for the property, and how much is it going to cost to close? Are there any working capital contributions or transfer fees associated with closing? So the management certificate is the document that's supposed to provide all that information to the public.
And that's filed where? And so how do you manage it? I've seen ours, that doesn't have that when we establish the property management. So what do they do with it so that people, where does it go then so people know where to find it?
Great question. 2 places. So the management certificate will go 2 places. One, it will be recorded in the property records for the county. Secondly, it now must be filed with the Texas Real Estate Commission. Yes, sir. Well, you need to get the management certificate recorded as soon as possible. So the remedy for not having one is to get one. And the statutory requirements are pretty self-explanatory. I have some associations that do it themselves. I just tell them to do it when they need to update the point of contact. I take a quick look as their attorney, and then I help them record it. Did that answer your question? Okay. So that's a very broad question. I can't really comment on what is the legality of it, but all I can say is they need to be brought into compliance. If there isn't a management certificate, there must be one. I'm not entirely sure of the website, but is that it? Yeah, thank you, Jesus. That does happen. That does happen a lot. What your actual name of your subdivision is may be different than what the entity's name is. So the recording fee is usually county specific, and it's something along the lines of $20 for the first page and $5 for the second page. But the preparation of the management certificate could possibly be a different cost parameter, and that would be community specific depending on the size of the community and whether or not the lawyer needs to be involved in its creation.
So that could be done in-house with the management company's legal team, or is it done with, say, like your firm?
So I would,
Higher.
yeah, so there's two different ways I would approach it. If it's a management certificate that just needs a quick update, you know, Sally Sue is no longer our point of contact and now it's John James, well, you don't necessarily need a lawyer to bless that. But if there's been several declaration amendments and maybe there's 25 different platted sections to the community, that's where I would pull in the lawyer and to make sure that all the plats and all the declaration references and amendments and annexations are properly referenced in there. So the smaller the community, the more straightforward and simpler the management certificate is. The larger the community, the more complex it is, the more likely you're leaning towards engagement of an attorney. But it should be the association's attorney. Lastly, on the required policies, there's an enforcement and fine policy that will be required come January 1st if any of you have fining authority. This was a recent change in our legislation. If your community has fining authority, the law will require you to adopt an enforcement and fine policy identifying the different categories for which there may be fines and then the fine amounts. There's some also additional information that has to be in there, but that's definitely a legal step. And yes, sir. Good question. They do not have to be separate policies. What we have seen is that's we kind of refer to it as a community manual, where it's one document that has all of these policies individually. The problem with, it's kind of a, pro and con. It's great because there's one place where all your policies exist. The problem is if you have to amend one of those policies, well, then you have to amend the entire document instead of just amending that one policy. So it's really style and what is preferred. But just make sure come January 1st, if you have fining authority, that you address this enforcement and fine policy. And then finally, contract bidding. For any contracts that are over $50,000, the law last session changed to require that contract to be bid in accordance with a policy. It's not an overly long statute. There's not a whole lot of meat or substance to it telling us what that means. It doesn't say exactly how many contract bids must be submitted, but it just says that if the contract's over $50,000, you have to bid it in accordance with the policy. And so what most associations did was they memorialized what was already their SOP on contract bidding. You get multiple bids. You try to make sure that they're reputable, they have insurance, you check their references, and maybe there's an exception built in if the contract that you're asking to be bid really isn't one that there's multiple vendors out there. I have seen that, so there's no specific requirement that you have to get 3 bids or anything that granular. Not required, but recommended, and know that this is not an exhaustive list. These are just kind of the high points, and maybe they exist in your community, maybe they don't, maybe you need them, maybe you don't. Collection policy. Sometimes I see the collection policy and the payment plan policy together in one. So you may check your collection policy to see if you have payment plan guidelines. Installation of solar panels, roofing materials, electric generators, political signs, rainwater harvesting devices, flags, the display of the American flag, Texas flag, and any branch of the military. There's a very specific statute on what HOAs can regulate there. Xeriscaping or drought-tolerant landscaping. Architectural guidelines. Those come into play. What color does the house need to be? Where does the number on the house need to be? What do mailboxes need to look like, et cetera, et cetera. Security measures and perimeter fencing. That's a concept that came out of the last legislative session. A lot of associations adopted policies because it helped regulate what would the front yard fencing look like if someone were to install it. So a lot of communities, as we sat before the legislation, you could not install front yard fencing. This perimeter fencing legislation changed that, but gave HOA some regulatory authority as to what it looks like or what it could look like. Okay, a little more, drilling down a little bit into your declarations or your restrictive covenants. The overall function of that document is to preserve and to protect property values. This goes back conceptually, I think the first deed restriction case in Texas Supreme Court goes back to the 1920s. And the idea was, even way back then, that an agreement not to do something on my piece of property benefits my neighbor, and in exchange for that, my neighbor agrees not to do the same thing on his or her property. And so that's where the benefit comes in terms of, I agree I can't run a business out of my home, and that's good for my neighbor, but my neighbor makes the same agreement, and then we are able to preserve and protect our property values because there is some type of deed restriction enforcement. They'll say what you can do on the property, what you can't, and will contain the rights of enforcement. This is just an overview of the typical functions of HOAs: maintaining common areas, community signage, recreation centers, pools, parks, streetscapes. I didn't see any hands raised that have private streets. Levying and collecting assessments, enforcement of restrictions, adoption of rules and regulations, some of those things I just went over a few slides ago. Maintaining insurance policies. There's a few different places where you'll see insurance. One, if you have common area, probably need to have some general liability coverage for those common areas. And if there's a structure, you need to have some kind of insurance coverage there as well. But also for you as individual directors and officers insurance coverage. I'll kind of expand more on that in the third segment, but if you are volunteering for your board of directors, or if I was, the first question I would ask, does the association have directors and officers insurance coverage? Because that's what's going to cover me individually if I happen to be named in a lawsuit. And that's just what individuals do today. I don't want to really scare anybody here. You volunteered for the board, and that means you're going to get sued. The point I'm trying to make by referencing it at all is what inevitably happens when someone's upset with the HOA, they'll sue the entity, and then they'll sue the individual directors. But know that it's very easy to get you out of that suit through volunteer immunity. If you have directors and officers insurance coverage, you'll be covered. You don't have to pay out of pocket for the lawyer. But those guardrails that I mentioned to you are important. You have to stay within those guardrails. So before everybody gets scared and walks out and resigns, let me just make sure I make that clear. But I'll definitely dig deeper or dive deeper into that so you'll understand what I mean.
Real quick, what is the recommended amount for that? Like 100,000, a million? Like, what is it being like proposed?
Yes. So I don't have the exact parameters under the statute memorized. I think there may be a slide near the end covering those insurance parameters, but it's usually $1 million is the coverage.
You would recommend that way we are protected against doing that thing?
Yeah, it's dangerous for a lawyer to make recommendations on insurance coverage. That's more of a broker function. The lawyer should be telling you, hey, here's where there's some risk areas for you where you might need to talk to a broker about insurance coverage. Questions as to how much coverage, that's where your broker steps in and the specific types of coverage. But it's very, if you think that there's going to be some risk, and I know I'm going beyond the scope of your question, but it's good to remember this. Anything that you're about to do, if you think there's going to be some risk, the two experts that you need to call or think about calling, your legal counsel and your insurance broker. You know, hey, we want to have a bouncy castle at our spring festival. You know, let's call our lawyer and let's call our insurance broker to make sure if something happens, there's insurance coverage for it. Vendor contracts, that's another function of HOA. Engagement of vendors to maintain the community, install landscaping, clean your pool, or lifeguards, or really the extent of vendors is endless, and it depends on your particular community. As legal counsel for HOAs, I'm a vendor of HOAs. Could be a CPA if you're getting an audit. Could be an architect if you're doing some work to your recreation center. Could be a landscape architect even. And then the operation of the architectural committee. Has anybody here served on their architectural committee? No? Oh, a couple of hands back there. I think that's even, may even be a tougher job than serving on the board of directors. Not to take anything away from the struggles of board members. It's real. But those that serve on architectural committees often, especially if it's a custom build, ground up community, they take a lot of punches, in my experience. So the funding of community associations. And maybe I'll tell, this is a good point for me to tell a quick story about my experience as a homeowner in general. As I've lived in, I currently live in a deed restricted community. Previously, I lived in a completely unrestricted community. And before that, I lived in a community that had a volunteer concept. It was deed restricted, but to be a member of the HOA, I had to pay $25 a year if I wanted to. So what ultimately, that's a kind of a good example to show you the lifespan of associations as entities. Because, yes, sir. Yes, and the dirt itself may have deed restrictions, but being a member of the corporate entity may be voluntary. And usually the signal of whether it's mandatory or voluntary is, do you have to pay your assessments or not? If you have to pay assessments, then it's mandatory and it's not voluntary. But my story was involved a 1960s community, and they had a voluntary assessment obligation. Now, we just had one sign on each side of the community. We didn't have any real large common areas. Our main concern was security. So every year they would send out a letter, hey, who wants to chip in for the off-duty law enforcement to drive up and down our community? And I gladly would pay multiples of $25 for that security, as did most of my neighbors. But let's say that my neighbor next door to me wanted to run a business out of his house. Well, the organization that would have pursued that violation of deed restrictions had less than $3,000 in the bank. Because if you give people a choice as to whether or not they want to pay, I know how big the check would be regarding my property taxes if it was voluntary, but I have to do it to keep my house. And so I write the check. But that was an experiment, I'll say, back in the probably 60s, 70s, and 80s, where they were experimenting with this voluntary HOA concept, and it turns out it doesn't work. Just because if you give people the option to pay, they won't. And if there's not an entity that is funded, then who's going to enforce the restrictions when someone opens up a business next door to you? And so that is essentially the birth or the impetus behind mandatory HOAs. If we expected everybody to do the right thing, there wouldn't be HOAs. But because they don't, so not all HOAs are built perfectly or run perfectly, but they exist to help give a legal remedy for those that may have a condition going on next door to them that isn't good for their property values. So it's a foreclosable concept. I say this to members, at large when I have the audience of an entire community. A quick way that you as members of this community can avoid never having to talk to me: pay your bill on time, keep your yard clean, submit an application if you're going to improvement, and you'll never hear from the association's lawyer. So the point of that is I think lawyers should take the opportunity when they're speaking to the membership at large to kind of impress the significance of paying the assessments, because that's what helps keep the community running appropriately. And if it's one thing that everybody agrees on, let's not give lawyers any more money than we have to. So that usually gets a big chuckle out of the audience, especially the homeowners when I say it. So you may have special assessments as well. That may be a concept that comes in when there's a big expense that's outside the typical budget. Let's levy a special assessment to kind of bridge the gap. There may be other assessments that come in. You may have heard me mention the working capital contribution. That might be a portion of the sales price. It is, or maybe a flat fee goes to the association that's put in a reserve account to fund the future maintenance of like swimming pools, parks, roads if you had them. There may be specific or individual assessments. If somebody isn't complying with the documents, we may have the right to pursue them as an individual. And then you heard me mention reserve funding. So let's see here. And I apologize, there is a spelling error on this next slide. I fixed it in the PowerPoint, but you'll see it in your materials. I take ownership of that. Owners, usually defined as someone who is a fee simple owner of the lot. And know that this portion of the presentation was something that I've experimented with in speaking with a community at large. A lot of the education that I do it directly to board members, and even more so now directly to architectural committee members. But that leaves out the homeowners. And so I experimented a little bit with what I called an HOA 101 concept, where I would present kind of the basics to the members of communities. They're not board members, they're just owners. Kind of increase the chances that everybody's going to get along, follow the rules, pay their bill on time, etc. And there's an opportunity to build community spirit as well. The membership rights usually are per the declaration or sometimes in the bylaws. It will say something along the lines of every owner shall be a member of the association, i.e. that's mandatory. A membership shall be appurtenant to and may not be separated from ownership of a lot. So if you own a lot, you're a member, and you have to be a member. That's pretty indicative of that mandatory versus voluntary concept that I discussed previously. Your restrictive covenants: architecture, landscaping, use, and conduct. That's really where I will push owners to read the governing documents, read them more than once. It's dangerous to be a Google lawyer. I see that a lot in communities where homeowners will Google things and they'll come to a meeting and they've taken the time to do some research online, but they haven't taken time to read the governing documents that actually touch the property. So again, education is the rising tide that raises all ships. And so I push even owners to read the governing documents, because it usually results in a more understood experience both by the directors and by the owners. Covered the assessment obligations of owners. I hear it enough to mention it to you, but I hear it a lot. I didn't know I was in an HOA. I didn't know I had to pay assessments. I didn't sign anything saying I wanted to be part of this. Well, back to some TREC requirements. If you're in a mandatory HOA, there's a bold sentence or two in the earnest money contract that says you are signing into a mandatory HOA. There is a foreclosable lien if you do not pay assessments. So whether or not it's read, I'm sorry? Correct. There's right. From the get-go, from the sales contract forward, there's content in the documentation that indicates the property is subject to an HOA and a mandatory assessment obligation. That's typically the earnest money contract. The very first document that they'll sign that says, I'm interested in buying this property. And the gentleman back there referenced an addendum that comes with it too. So for those owners that claim ignorance, you know, I get it. The closing process is no longer simple. When I closed on a piece of property in 2006, the stack of documents was that thick. It took me 5 minutes. All I had to do was fog up a mirror and show them I was alive, and they gave me the loan, gave me the house. In 2014, the stack of documents was this thick, and they didn't believe who I was. I had to have 2 different forms of ID. So there's a lot going on in the closing process these days, and if homeowners happen to miss that mandatory language, it doesn't surprise me, but it's an opportunity for education. Yes, ma'am. So, good question. So essentially, I'll restate the question for everybody, and correct me if I don't have it precise, but for a developing community, how is the HOA chosen or created, and who does it? And the way it works, the developer is the entity that essentially engages legal counsel to, you know, hey, we're going to buy this piece of property, we're going to develop it, and, you know, we're going to call it Happy Trails Meadows. And then the lawyer creates the governing document package, which includes most, if not all, of the things I've mentioned here. And those documents are recorded, and essentially any lot that is sold thereafter is part of the HOA. I mean, the HOA is created at the very beginning. Let me make sure I'm clear on that. As we have the dirt's been subdivided by the plat, and now we're attaching to the dirt these restrictions, and then we're also creating the entity that's going to enforce the restrictions. All of that happens at the very beginning, and it should happen before anybody at all ever takes title. Any end user, consumer like yourself, takes title. And developers usually work with their lawyer or an HOA industry lawyer to do that. I do help some developers do that. And then from there, everybody that takes title is a member of the HOA. Spot on. Spot on. Yeah, there's a time the developer's running the show, and then eventually they hand the keys and the checkbook to the resident who take control. Well said, sir. Thank you. So the voting rights of members and owners, I put this in here because I hear it a lot from owners. Well, you know, we should have a say in how our money's spent, and we should get a vote on this. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes it's not. But it's very finite what members get to vote on. I mean, just like your local government works, your HOA is designed to have the members elect directors that make decisions for the community. And so your directors are the elected representatives of your community. So you're putting your faith in them to make decisions that are in the best interest of the entity. And the things that the members can vote on, very, very limited. They vote on the election of directors, amendment to the declaration, amendment to the articles or the certificate of formation, increases in assessments, sometimes special assessments, and there's not much else. There could be, it could be community specific, but whenever I have a homeowner say, we signed this landscaping contract and I don't remember voting on it, and we should get a vote in who landscapes our community. The fact of the matter is there's probably no voting right there. The board alone has the right to enter into contracts for the association entity. That doesn't mean the board shouldn't communicate with the membership, and a lot of times those questions are or concerns that those owners have are just focused on the lack of information or better communication. So,
One question on that particular where does it show in our documents what the members have the right to vote on that? We usually distribute that page to them or put it on whatever media site we needed to, or direct them to that when we do get that a lot.
right.
So where can I direct them to in our documents?
Good question. It's unfortunately not all going to be in one place, but you'll look in the declaration, as that will govern the amendment to the declaration, increases in assessments and special assessments. They'll be in 3 different places. Election of directors will most likely be in your bylaws, but it could also be in your declaration as well. The amendment to articles of incorporation or formation, that's in those specific documents, but some of it's also in the business organizations code as well. And then when I say other, there may be places such as, that may be in the bylaws, it could be in the declaration. So in order for you to get that exhaustive list, that's definitely a lawyer question. Can you give us a list of everything that the owners get to vote on? And if you're dealing with that question over and over again, it's a good strategy to just remind everybody, of course in a very friendly, neighborly way, just so everybody knows here are the things that you get to vote on members, but everything else you've kind of entrusted with the board of directors, and we're going to do the best we can to act in the best interest of the community, but know that you don't get to vote on the landscaping contract or the pool contract or something like that. Yeah, fair point. If they don't show up for the meetings, how are they going to vote? And apathy is one of the community association's biggest enemy. Yes, sir. Oh, whoops. This one? That's correct. The threshold is usually different for each one of these voting rights, and they're actually going to be community specific. So community A, it may take a different standard to raise the annual assessments, for example, than community B. Yes. Correct. So, yes, sir, go ahead. Yeah, I was just going to say, amending the declaration, there's a statute that says the threshold to amend your declaration is 67%, unless there's a lower percentage in your declaration. Most declarations I see, it's 66 and 2/3 or even 67%. A few declarations I'll see majority, but just know that's statutorily driven. So if your community declaration says 80%, know that there's a statute that trumps that 80% and lowers it to 67.
And then last thing is, so what lines are we looking for? It's going to be scattered throughout our declaration. You're saying, I guess our choice would just be to hand it over to our attorneys and ask them to draft something, because otherwise I'm wondering what lines am I looking for? Members may only vote on, or like, what are we looking for? Because, I mean, my book's with me, and I keep flipping as you're talking, and I'm like, oh, this is not as easy to find sometimes. So is there a specific line that would cue us into, oh, this is a member voting section?
So it's a phrase where you'll see a reference to a percentage of the ownership interest or a percentage of total votes of the community. It'll be different for every governing document, but let's take amendment to the declaration, for example. That's probably going to be near the end of your DCC&Rs. The amendment provisions are almost always at the end, and it's usually a standalone paragraph, and it's a couple of sentences. So that one's probably pretty easy to find. When it comes to annual assessments or special assessments, for example, that will be in your assessment section, and what I usually see in the annual assessments realm is the board has some authority to raise it without the members, without a vote of the members, by a certain percentage. And then, but beyond that percentage, if there's going to be an increase, then it's subject to a member's vote. So. So there's two places where you'll look for what I'll call voting rights or methods of voting. And one is your bylaws. It's usually dictates, in person, by proxy, absentee, or electronic. Those are really the four methods of voting that are possible in an HOA. That's usually covered in your bylaws. If your bylaws predate 2011, they'll probably only reference proxy and in-person voting. The reason 2011 is a marker is the laws changed to expand the voting rights to include those additional two, absentee voting and electronic voting. My personal preference is that your bylaws are amended in a manner to be consistent with the property code. But to kind of drill down to what we learned from the pandemic, with virtual meetings and electronic voting and absentee ballots even, I've attended several annual meetings and elections now where all the voting is done and closed before the annual meeting is even called to order. And so the annual meeting is more of an announcement of who won, as opposed to a 3-hour marathon that I went to on Tuesday night, where it was in person and by proxy, and there were 350 people there, and we had, a 45-minute, delay because of the sign-in process and a 2-hour vote tabulation process. So I'm a big fan of electronic voting and even absentee ballots, but I would love to see that specifically addressed in your bylaws. Even though that option is in the statute, I want your bylaws to mirror what's in the statute. But those, correct. It's not mandated that you require or that you offer electronic voting. What the statute says is you at least have to offer absentee ballots or proxy voting. So, owners, read the governing documents more than once. New documents may come through. So the documents that existed on your property as the day you bought it, they may have changed. Things can be amended, policies are added, the laws change, and lawyers make recommendations on updates from time to time. So, owners have a financial obligation to the association, maintenance and compliance obligations. They do have a right to vote on certain key issues. And again, read the governing documents. This may be a good time for us to take a break. I know I've gone a little bit further than 45 minutes, but
You asked a lot of questions, you're good.
okay. Should we keep going, or do y'all want to take a break? Break? Okay. Asking questions, but if you see me hustling through some of these slides, it's probably just so that I can make sure we get to the end at the appropriate time, which is 2 o'clock. We'll take one more break before the end of this. But yeah, good stuff. Great questions thus far. Thank you for your attention. So, board members, and again, this is that HOA 101 presentation that I often will give to communities as a whole so that owners understand what they have to do and they also understand what board members have to do. But generally speaking, board members make decisions on behalf of the association as the non-profit corporation or entity, with the exception of the decisions that are made by the members or the owners. The general authority in the Texas Business Organizations Code and the governing documents usually covers something along the lines of anything necessary and appropriate for the administration of the affairs, duties, rights of the entity per the governing documents. So that might be a phrase that you'll see in the certificate of formation of the Articles of Incorporation. But you've heard me talk a lot about your governing documents, and I want to make sure I don't ignore the statutes. Someone asked me in the back during our break about Chapter 209 of the Property Code. Yes, that's a great place for you as directors to find content as it relates to the operation of your HOA. Also, reading statutes is a great cure for insomnia. So if you have trouble sleeping, pull out Chapter 209 of the Property Code. You see here a reference to the Texas Business Organizations Code. That is the code that governs how entities in Texas operate. Specifically, Chapter 22 governs nonprofit entities. So the way I like to generally describe to people that ask me what I do every day, I say it's a little bit corporate governance because I'm dealing with nonprofit HOAs, but it has a huge real estate component, and that's the Property Code reference. So Chapter 22 of the Business Organizations Code, Chapter 209 of the Property Code, and your governing documents gives you about 85–90% of what you need to know. Okay. Board members, generally speaking, prepare and adopt budgets, levy and collect assessments to fund the common expenses, operation, care, upkeep, and maintenance of the common areas, sometimes hiring personnel. That could be management, that could be legal, that could be a CPA. Again, making, amending rules and regulations, contracts, enforcing covenants, and engagement of experts. I definitely want to hammer on this a little bit. I'll expand on it later, but you as directors, just because you've raised your hand to volunteer and have been elected by the people, doesn't automatically make you the go-to expert on everything, or at least it shouldn't. You may bring your experience, your knowledge, your degrees, your certifications to the table, And that's definitely beneficial for your organization, for your community. But I definitely don't want any of you to be the expert for the entity. If you happen to be a CPA for your community, or be a CPA but you're on the board, I don't want you to be the CPA for the HOA. Bring your CPA knowledge to the table and use it to hold the association CPA accountable, but the organization should have its own expert. That goes for legal, that goes for an engineer, that goes for someone that's knowledgeable in landscaping. Engage outside experts because that provides you with some layer of insurability. Committee members. So I think oftentimes committees are an underutilized concept in HOAs. Board members, if you're, yes sir, go ahead. Audits. Yeah. So is it recommended that HOAs get regular audits done? I think the short answer to that is yes, they should. What is the timing interval? I think would be dependent on the size of the association's budget. I would just tell you what I see in the industry, and this isn't necessarily a legal opinion, it's just what I see in the industry. I see anywhere from annual audits to audits every 3 years, and what I hear mostly is don't go beyond every 5 years without having an audit. It's worth mentioning that during our legislative session, there was a bill that was pending that would have required annual audits for HOAs. Condominiums, annual audits are already required. It's only a matter of time before annual audits are required for HOAs. So it's a best practice, 3 years every year. You're probably going to have to do it one day anyway. And oddly, the pending legislation required an audit, but didn't require that it be done by a CPA. I have a good friend of mine that's a CPA, and his head was spinning around because he said if it's an audit and it's not done by a CPA, what is that exactly? And he actually took the time to put some language together that we took to our lawmaker to bring that up. If you're going to require HOAs to do an audit, you probably should require that it also be done by a CPA, because otherwise, what is an audit? Yes, sir. Committee members. So I think boards that maybe you're spending more time than you initially thought you were going to spend volunteering for your community, committees may help relieve some of that pressure. It's typically supported by your declaration. All of you probably have an ACC or an architectural review committee of sorts. That's probably already created via the terms of your declaration. But just know that you can have other committees. You can have a finance committee or a budget committee, a landscape committee, a social committee even. Really, there can be a committee for any purpose. And oftentimes, I'll recommend to boards that maybe there's a group or an individual that's showing up at every meeting, wishes things were different, they want to make change, and they're a very vocal member of the community. Sometimes they have a point, and sometimes maybe not so much. But putting that individual on a committee can be a great way to give that person something to do that will help benefit the community. It alleviates some pressure from the board of directors, and it's more or less a win-win. And committees are appointed by the board. And I'm making this motion here, drawing a square, that committees have to act within a certain scope of authority as identified by the board. So committee members aren't necessarily get to make decisions like the board. They don't get to bind the board or the association into contract, but the committee gets together and in an advisory context will get together, meet, maybe discuss other things with members in the community at large, and then take their ideas to the board. Let's call it a landscape committee for a moment. We will often use those committees when we expect some differing and passionate views as to what the community entrance should look like. And it takes a lot of heat off the board if they create a landscape committee and that landscape committee is made up of individuals from different parts of the community, and maybe that landscape committee goes to see what everybody's thoughts, opinions, and feelings are about the front entrance. That landscape committee presents a set of ideas to the board of directors, and maybe there's a vote by the board as to which one of those ideas is best for the front entrance. But it takes the heat off the board in terms of you're not making that decision all by yourself, and anyone that challenges you on you've used our money and you didn't ask what our opinion was. Nope, we did. We had a landscape committee. They sought feedback from the community, and we made our decision based on the options that the community presented to us. A great way to stay ahead of some of those community disputes. Fair enough. They'll happen anyway, yes. Despite your best efforts, there is someone who will think that you could have done it differently. But that is usually a very, very small percentage of your community, although the volume may be pretty loud from that group. So the practical benefits of committees, not only do they assist the board and management with the operations of the community, it allows a better connection to the community. The board can actually kind of get the pulse of the community. What are the members saying? What do they want? What do they like? What do they dislike? And it gets, as much as you can practically possible, get ahead of some of those complaints that the board is not implementing the will of the people. It's also a great training ground for future board members. So what I will often recommend, if there's been a lot of candidates, more candidates for the board than there are open seats. Those that volunteered but maybe didn't get elected, they may be good candidates for committees. So they've already raised their hand. They've already indicated a willingness to volunteer some time. So take that person that didn't get elected to the board and try to find a committee, if it makes sense, to put them on. So, and lastly, and this one's very hard to measure, it's very subjective, but it helps foster and build community spirit. When everybody's working together to do something good for their community, there's a value there. At the end of the day, based on what I see in these community disputes, there's a value to enjoying where you live. Whether you're a director, whether you're a committee member, or whether you're just a normal resident, typical resident, there's a certain value to liking where you live. And these community disputes, of which I've navigated numerous of them across the years, and they usually result in tens of thousands of dollars in attorney fees, they have the potential to create a rift in your community. People side up. They choose sides. They choose directors. They choose who they like. And neighbors that were once friends may no longer be friends when these disputes. So I don't want to go too far into the negatives that I've seen, but know that what I have seen over the years, I can't ignore the value of community spirit and enjoying where you live. And that's a key benefit of creating these committees. So management. Jen? Yes, ma'am.
So we have some of those committees, the landscape committee I never thought of, I love that idea. How do you just have an open, when we're at a regular board meeting, put it on an agenda, and the board just vote and say, hey, so we've decided we want to add a landscape committee, we've already made guidelines, how do we instill some committee though?
Perfect. So I think a good approach is first try to solicit volunteers for the landscape committee. You may already have individuals in mind that perhaps show up and are vocal about the landscaping. Great to put them on the committee. I do think it's important, but not required, to have at least one committee member be a director. Maybe that's not within your bandwidth or the bandwidth of any of the directors, but if you can have a director also serve on the committee, it's a good oversight mechanism. And then once you figure out who are your committee members, then you put it as an agenda item at a board meeting, and you board votes to create the landscape committee to be governed by the scope of authority in the landscape committee charter. And a committee charter can be a template document where the purpose for that committee can be filled in, and that landscape committee's parameters will be whatever the board sets it to be. But a committee charter in the template sense should cover some of the do's and don'ts that I've already mentioned. Committee can't make decisions for the organization, can't enter into contracts for the organization. Stay off social media, in the negative sense. Be nice to each other, and there's some, play well with others parameters of this committee charter that I'm mentioning. Because I'll often have committee members go onto social media and voice all the things that they think should have happened that the board disagreed with them on. And that's a real quick way to get booted off the committee. But anyway, you want positive community spirit. I'm going beyond the scope of your question, but that's kind of the mechanism that I would put into place for any committee.
And does it work the same if you want to get rid of something? The committee, we have a yard of the month.
Yeah.
So if we want to remove committees or just committees, we call it outlines or guidelines, and you're calling it charters.
Mhm.
Same concept.
That's correct.
Is that still here an open board meeting to say we're going to go ahead and delete these guidelines or update these guidelines, or how is it?
Yeah, you could, I suppose, rescind the Yard of the Month committee, or
Or if we want to combine a couple, or, you know what I mean? Like I'm trying to, our committee, you need some help with that, so.
I've seen that. I've seen I can't remember what they called it, but there were two committees that, basically one governed landscape in the community and the other governed the aesthetics of the common area. And mostly the buildings or the improvements in the common area. And what we did was we combined them and gave them a fancy new committee title, and then took the scope of authority from both of their charters and just put it into one. So that, as long as you're more or less following what I'll call it, the corporate adoption or governance process when it comes to creating, modifying, or disbanding or rescinding these committees, that's really where your corporate governance requirements would kick in.
Yeah, can you do that, Nick? Can you add some kind of like, we're going to try this landscape committee for the next 2 years, and if after 2 years it didn't go anywhere, it's automatically dissolved, and we have to, I don't like creating work if
Right.
it doesn't work out either.
Yes, so you can create either add a sunset provision or a timeline for that committee in the charter, or let's go back to my hypothetical of the landscaping up front. You can just create an ad hoc landscape committee for the sole purpose of helping make a decision as to what we do with the front entrance, which that purpose of that committee will just fall by the wayside once the project's complete. But you can build that timeline, that sunset, into the charter. That's a good point. You want your committee members to feel like the time that they volunteered is valuable, and you don't want them to be blindsided by, I'm sorry, we don't need your help anymore. If it's in the charter, they know it from the get-go. So, good point. It does. As long as the committee is operating within the course and scope of that charter, and they will be pulled within that director and officer insurance umbrella I mentioned earlier. Okay, moving on to management. Generally speaking, the role of your management company will be to serve the board as the representative of the corporate entity and implement board decisions. The simple way I put it, the board decides the policy, the management company implements it. That's an oversimplification, but that's really kind of technically how it works. And here's just a partial listing of some of the functions of management companies. It really is contract specific. And so definitely want to look at your management contract to figure out whether these things are part of it. This is not intended to say that this is what they should do or they have to do, but these are the things that I often see in management contracts. So the management company functions kind of two roles. Some of it's back room, managing the accounting, keeping the books and records, but some of it's front facing, and I've often seen managers kind of running meetings, whether it's a board meeting or a member meeting, giving reports at meetings. That usually the managing agent or entity is the custodian of the books and records of the entity. So if there's a books and records request under that production policy that I mentioned at the very beginning, theoretically that request will go to the contact within the management certificate, which would be in theory your management company, and then the management company would compile the books and records that are responsive to the request. But if once the contract ends, the records go back to the association entity or go to the successor management company. Management companies will help with bids for vendor services. One of the values of a professional management company is access to tested and reputable vendors, so that you don't have to go out and find a lawyer that practices in this area, for example, or find a landscaper. They'll have their companies that they're used to working with, lawyers, CPAs, et cetera, et cetera. And what inevitably happens is you reap the benefit from the testing of those vendors across multiple associations. So a management company may have 100 associations. And if a certain vendor is not pulling their weight, and that happens across multiple associations, that vendor is going to be tested on a variety of clients. So ultimately what will happen is the management company will stop recommending a particular vendor if they're not providing service at the level that benefits the management company's clients. If I didn't do a good job for my associations, management companies would stop putting my name out there as a potential lawyer for their association. So there's a certain kind of built-in accountability and benefit when it comes to the kind of tested and reputable vendors. There's a pre-screening process for most service providers, including insurance, reputation. I hear it all the time from homeowners. I know a guy that can mow our front entrance for $20 an hour. Well, I'm sure they're out there. The chuck in the truck, there's no shortage of a guy out there that will mow. But that chuck in the truck probably doesn't have insurance. If something happens, if that person gets injured on association property, guess who they're going to look to for the recovery for that injury? They're going to look to the association and the association's insurance coverage. I stepped in a hole while I was mowing your front entrance. I twisted my ankle. I can't work for 6 months. Chuck in the truck doesn't have insurance. Chuck in the truck is going to file a premises liability claim against the association. So what you may save on a contractor on the front end, usually you may pay for on the back end if they're not properly insured. And this is one of the benefits, again, of having a management company pre-screen vendors before they come to you. Collection of assessments, both internally at the beginning, the invoicing process, the accounting process, and then also when a collection account is turned over to legal counsel, your management agent is usually the one that kind of is does the back and forth with the lawyer, the conduit of communication. The homeowner wants to pay in 6 months. Is that okay? That goes through the management company to the board, and you talk about whether to give, owner Smith their 7th payment plan because they defaulted 6 times prior. That communication goes through management. Same thing with compliance, whether or not someone's keeping their yard up to a certain standard. And then rarely, but still it happens, insurance claim management. Maybe I can tie that into the hailstorms we've had or seem to have every May or April. If you have a rec center and there's a roof and there was an insurance claim, your managing agent, your management company can help you with that claim. Noticing meetings, whether it's a board meeting or a member meeting, presiding over the annual meeting, that's kind of community specific. Sometimes sometimes I will preside over a particularly contentious meeting. Sometimes it's the manager, sometimes it's the president. It really just kind of is community specific there. Maintenance of the accounting, budgeting, financial accounts of the entity, social event implementation, communication with the members, and then again, fostering improvement of the community experience of the owners. Your management company can help you with those things. Oops, forgot to go forward on the slide there. So I'm going to, if y'all have any questions, again, kind of feel free to ask, but we're ready to move on to contracts unless anybody has any questions about what I've already discussed. Okay, contracts. I'll try to keep this as interesting as possible. Are all HOAs considered a 501c3? And the answer is no. A lot of them are, but not all of them are. It's usually going to be in the formation documents. That specific designation of 501c3 will be in your formation documents. And you heard me spend a lot of time on the articles and the certificate of formation, but I should have mentioned to you that it's not required that an association be incorporated. I have some associations, this goes back to the 60s, 70s, 80s. There's a lot of associations out there that are just not incorporated. Also, the more rural you get, the more likely it is that they are not incorporated, but they don't have to be. So. So I'm stepping into a realm that I'm not completely comfortable with when it comes to taxes. I do have a colleague in my office she's my go-to with nonprofit taxation, Katie David, and I just run down the hall and ask her when I have a tax question. I'm blessed to have a tax nerd in my office, but the basic understanding that I can give you right now is the 501c3 status could give you the opportunity to apply for and gain a sales tax exemption. So there's a process for applying for a sales tax exemption. It's very technical, it's code driven, it's for the tax nerds. But the 501c3 status would give you the opportunity to apply for that sales tax exemption, which would perhaps save you some money on sales tax when it comes to some of these large contracts that your entity may enter into. Okay, contracts. So let's figure out what we want. Let's figure out what our desired outcome is when it comes to contracting and conveying that message to the vendors. I have a reference in here to preparing a request for a proposal. I actually removed that content in the interest of time, but RFPs, I'll just touch on it while it's in front of me now. RFPs, generally speaking, are going to be for big ticket contracts. Not necessarily your regular landscape maintenance contract, but maybe it's a complete renovation of your swimming pool and it's going to be a six-figure contract and it's your only community asset that you have. That would be where I would recommend that you use an RFP or request for proposal process. But your run-of-the-mill hey, we got a guy that comes out and mows our front entrance and changes out the color and the flowers every, so often. You don't necessarily need an RFP for that. How to pull in your professional team, your lawyer, to make sure that the contract you're entering into is one that you should. Oftentimes, get the call, Brady, we're in a terrible contract, we're getting terrible service. What can we do to get out of it? We want out. Well, I'd say, well, send me your contract. And sometimes I'm handed one piece of paper, theoretically, or sent one piece of paper. Here's our contract. And it's basically just an invoice with the charge with a signature on it. And it's like, any rights to get out of a contract are within the body of the contract. So present some challenges is my point. So definitely pull your lawyer in to review a contract before you sign one, especially one that's high dollar or high risk. Negotiation and execution of the agreement, and then continuing to evaluate the work product of the vendor. So vendor in this instance, you've heard me kind of cover this somewhat, but anybody and anyone that could do work for your entity, whether that's a service vendor, some of them are listed here, or part of your professional team as well. Don't want to leave out insurance brokers. That's a very important part of your professional team, and you no doubt have a banker as well. So what do we really want? That's often an overlooked discussion, and you kind of heard my point on a mission statement or the purpose of the entity earlier on. Kind of use that same logic when it comes to your contract. What do we really want? We're not happy with whatever the circumstance is, or you're reaching out to a vendor to provide you some sort of service or value, but let's figure out exactly what you're looking to do, and that will increase the chances of success. Are you cost driven, or are you quality driven? Everybody wants the Cadillac for the price of the Buick. I mean, I do. But that's not always possible, and focusing on cost only may mean you're increasing your risk somewhere else. That chuck in the truck example that I gave you, you're going to save a lot of money on the chuck in the truck, but what happens if something goes wrong, and who's going to pay for it? And that increases your risk on the other end. What are our specific specifications? Do we have a specific time frame? Do we want strong insurance and indemnity? As a lawyer, that's one of the first places I go when I'm looking at a contract. The insurance provision, and who's priority, who's primary, and who's secondary. Which insurance policy, whether it's our insurance policy or the contractor's insurance policy. And then indemnity, to keep you from going to sleep. Indemnity is more of a liability shift. So, and that exists in most every contract. Association agrees to indemnify contractor for blah, blah, any claims or causes of action arising out of or related to this contract. I'm going to strike that because I don't want you as the customer to indemnify the contractor. I want the contractor to indemnify association. Indemnity provisions, another cure for insomnia. They're always in all caps, sometimes all caps and bold. It will make your brain hurt if you try to read it, but that is, I can't stress enough the significance of indemnity. And a good way to think about contracts is they're not for the marriage, they're for the divorce. So when you're entering into the contract, everybody's excited. The sales guy came out, made a great pitch. You're very excited about all the wonderful things that this vendor is going to do for your community. The contract is there for when obligations are not met, and gives you rights and direction to go when obligations aren't met, or even worse, there's litigation that comes out of that contract. And insurance indemnity really are going to be the guardrails for how that litigation is handled and whose insurance is writing the checks for that litigation. How's the association's message conveyed? I've seen very vague bid requests. We need a bid for landscaping. Well, what does that mean? Is that mowing? Are they trimming, landscaping? Are they installing new landscaping? Does it include sprinklers? Just get into the minutia of what you're really asking for from this vendor. And then also include the insurance requirements. Your management company should serve a good function here for you in terms of making sure that each vendor that is submitting a bid already satisfies the insurance requirements. But for any self-managed associations out there, know that you should be asking for a certificate of insurance from any vendors that you work with. And then, please send a bid for legal services. If I get that one, I want to make sure I'm understanding exactly what they want me to do. Am I just going to be providing corporate governance services? How many collection accounts do you have? How many compliance matters do you have? Are you having a community dispute and you need my help to navigate that? Is there a social media storm going on and you need some guidance on that? You need help with communication. So, corporate governance, collections, compliance, civility, and communication. And those are kind of the broad scope services that are available in the legal sense, but not every community needs all of those things at front or up front. You heard me reference previously a contract bidding policy. This is the statute that was passed last session, and it requires an HOA to solicit bids or proposals using a bid process established by the HOA if it chooses to contract for services that will cost more than $50,000. That is all the statute says. So, hence my point earlier, how many bids, how long do you wait, what if there's only 2 vendors in the market that provide those services? None of that is addressed in the statute. But it and that's a wonderful gap. Right. So there's really no answer to that question, because what it inevitably leads to is that per year, or is it $50,000 total? What if it's a $50,000 contract over the course of 5 years? Well, technically that's $10,000 a year. The statute doesn't address that. So what my advice is really what you typically do for a contract that is, more than $10,000, you probably get more than one bid, and you probably have a policy or a process that you follow. I shouldn't have said policy there, but you probably have a process that you follow. Which is simply going to be the same process that you would follow if it was over 50,000. So don't get too lost in $48,000 now, $3,000 later, because whatever process you're following for the $51,000 contract is probably the same process that you would follow for the $10,000 contract. No. Let me be clear on this. This does not require a member vote. This requirement just means that for a $50,000 contract or greater than $50,000, you have to adopt a policy and follow that policy for bidding the contract. It doesn't mean that the owners vote on it. So hopefully that addresses the concern. And so don't get too lost in, is it $50,000 over 3 years or $50,000, per payment? Just follow a bidding process and you'll fall within the parameters of this statute until they make changes, which I hope they don't. It's general enough that it allows some flexibility in the legal sense. Yes, it should be a written policy. kind of on-the-shelf contract bidding policy out there. You know, some associations never get close to a $50,000 contract. So I'll tell them, you don't have to have a contract bidding policy, but it's a good practice. You know, going above and beyond what the law requires you to do rarely gets you in trouble. But if you have any contract that's over $50,000, yes, you should have a written policy that is recorded with the county. Anybody that's, oh, yes, sir. Okay. First and foremost, you don't have to change your documents once you transition to resident controlled. I understand that's confusing to anybody that just picks them up and they read as if your community is developer controlled. My recommendation there, even though you don't have to change them, if for some reason you're going to amend your declaration, your DCCRs, because that's usually where this developer controlled language is. If you're in there amending them, go ahead and fix those provisions. But unless you're ready to make the investment up front to fix them when you don't necessarily have to. So let me say it a little shorter. If you want to spend the legal money to get the amendment drafted and you think the amendment will pass, you know, go for it. But I can't tell you that you have to do it. And so it's almost like, I'll use a mechanic metaphor here. You know, sometimes you take your car to the mechanic for problem A, and the mechanic says, well, you know, while I'm in here, you know, you're going to save some money if I fix problems B and C too. Because I already have half the engine disassembled. That parallels an amendment to your governing documents. You know, try to keep it short again. If you're in there changing your governing documents to prohibit short-term rentals, for example, you don't want Airbnbs in your community, and you're going to amend your governing documents for that. Well, heck, we're already in there. Let's pull out those developer-controlled provisions while we're already amending it for this other issue. And so developer-controlled associations is a definition under 209 of the property code, and it's not what your governing documents say as much as what is the condition of your community in reality. So if the developer's gone and turned over to the resident control, then you're not satisfying the developer-controlled definition in the property code. So even if your governing documents make you look like you might be developer-controlled, that doesn't automatically make you that. It's really what is happening in your community that satisfies that definition or not. Okay, so we've kind of touched on a lot of this already, but this is just an overview of a bid request and helping your vendor kind of provide a bid that's going to align with what you're really asking that vendor to do. So key contract terms. these are the places that I go when I look at a contract. What's the term of the contract? Does it automatically renew? Does it have a default, notice of default, cure period, cure default, on repeat concept? Let me kind of slow that down for you. I see so many contracts where if there's a breach of the contract, you have to provide a notice of that breach or notice of default. Then there's the opportunity to cure. And then if the cure happens, then it's done. But then it allows the vendor to, again, breach the contract or go into default, provide notice of the default. There's another cure period. And then, okay, contract's back in satisfaction again. Vendor defaults again, notice of cure period. You get my point. And so I have so many associations come to me and saying, we are getting bad service. We want out of this contract. What can we do to get out? If I see one of these default on repeat provisions, I say, well, you're going to have to provide notice of the default. Well, okay, what do we do after that? Well, you have to give them the opportunity to cure. Well, what happens if they cure? Well, then they're done. What happens if they default again? Start over. And so I 86 these out of the contract. If you're getting bad service, I want you to have the flexibility to get out of the contract. And so I build in I've seen termination provisions with cause or for cause. Well, in a contractual dispute, you say you were getting bad service. The contractor says you were a terrible customer to deal with. Was there cause to terminate or not? That just becomes the whole focal point of the litigation on the contract itself. So get rid of the for cause provisions. You'll have to balance this with the idea that for some vendors, there's a certain cost to ramp up and to take you on as a client. And so the vendor may want, a certain time period to go by before you can get an automatic out. If you have an automatic 30-day out provision, and let's say it's a long-term services contract, well, by the time they get you set up, they get you in their system, they start work, and then you say, you know what, we changed our mind, 30 days, we're out. Well, that vendor just made a huge investment in setting you up as a client that they're not going to get back. So this ease of termination concept should be balanced with what makes business sense for that particular vendor. And so sometimes I'll build in, I just did this yesterday, there shall be a 90-day termination notice period for any reason, with or without cause, but only after the contract has been in place for 365 days from the effective date. So that contract has to be in place for at least a year, and then that 90-day out for any reason right kicks in. So that allowed the vendor to make some money off the deal, but then allows the association to get out of the contract if after a year they decide this isn't working. I don't want to pick on waste disposal companies, but they have very specific automatic renewal provisions, very specific notice of non-renewal provisions, and I have seen it more than once. And this isn't just waste disposal companies, but more than once where there's a very specific notice period. The contract is for 5 years, and you have to provide notice of non-renewal between 30 days and 60 days before the expiration of that 5 years. Not only that, that notice of non-renewal has to be sent via certified mail, return receipt requested, to Bob Smith at 123 Fake Street. And it could be a terrible experience for you as an association, as a customer. And then you tell the salesperson you're not renewing. You send an email to that salesperson saying, we're not a happy customer. We want out of this contract. It's all acknowledged. And then you miss that 60 to 30 day window, and that email is not certified mail, return receipt requested. that contract may have auto-renewed for another 5-year period. And the only way out of it is usually to buy your way out. And I have helped associations sometimes buy their way out of a terrible contract because they got bitten by an automatic renewal provision. So any money that you're going to save by not sending the contract to your lawyer for a quick glance, you may end up paying in the long run for being trapped in a terrible contract. So oh, yes, sir. Yeah, so I haven't ever seen any legislation be put forth to that extent that would put in, a cap or a length of time limit on contractual periods. What I have seen in some bylaws and in some declarations even is maximum contractual periods. That's the exception, not the rule, but know that it is a possibility to build it into the governing documents. Mm-hmm. Right. I can't recall any experiences, like any governing documents that are that specific. And I can't recall any specific contracts that are that specific. But, as a practical matter, when it comes to the length of contract, to me, it has to make sense for whatever the services are that are being provided. I could make a pretty good case that, for example, a management company, there might be some benefit to having a longer contract. You would want the company to get to know your community over an extended period of time, and then you can probably get a better deal if you enter into a longer contract. And I say that because I've seen associations that hop from management company year to year to year, and it takes 60 to 90 days for a transition to be complete. And so an association that hops contracts on a year-to-year basis is at least part of the year in a constant state of transition. Your homeowners don't know where to send the check. They don't know who to call for the problem. And so I can see a certain benefit for certain services to have longer contracts. But, a 5-year contract that doesn't allow any flexible out, I've got a problem with that. I mean, if it's a 5-year contract with any vendor that you can get out of with 30, 60, 90 days notice for any reason, who cares if it's 5 years? You can get out of it in 30, 60, 90 days. It's the 5-year contract that automatically renews that you can't get out of unless you prove a breach, and that breach goes uncured. That's where I have a problem with the length. So... So, yes, that are over 50 or under 50? Under 50? Yeah, I mean, technically, there's no legislation that addresses contracts that are under 50. But kind of hitting the point that it's a good practice to have a bid solicitation process. So whether the contract is for 50,000 or for 5,000, it's good to get multiple bids. It's good to make sure they have appropriate insurance coverage. It's good to make sure they have a good reputation in the industry. It's good that they have references. So the 50, hence my point, don't get too hung up on the 50,000 over under, because it's a practice that most associations were implementing before the law even passed. I see. I see. So, homeowners are going to have the right to enter into contract with whomever or whatever entity they want, but they can't necessarily, use those contractors for our common areas unless, it makes sense to do so. So, I mean, if a homeowner comes up and says, I've got this great landscaper, they do more than just cut yards. I'd really like to bring this person to the board or this entity to the board to consider for our, common areas. That's possible. Of course, I'm going to hammer on the insurance and indemnity and all the fun lawyer things that lawyers will have a great way of taking the fun out of everything. But I'm just trying to protect the entity. So, yeah. So when it comes to insurance, as part of the contract, it's really going to depend on the scope of services for this contract and the risk level. I'll use a couple of easy examples, and this is a true story. There was a spring festival where a vendor was hired that has, have you seen one of these kid trains? Just a lawnmower that's pulling a bunch of cars behind it, and pay $1, the kid gets to go for a ride. My kids love it. I did it at the spring festival at our school. But there was no contract. The child sticks his or her head out the side of the train. It hits a tree. Injury, but not a fatality, so it could have been a lot worse. Of course, the question comes to the lawyers, what do we do? Whose insurance is paying for this? What is our risk level? And I say, show me your contract. Oh, well, it was only a $250 premium, so we didn't think a contract was necessary. So we have this motorized train that's pulling children, through the common area, and we don't know if this guy has insurance. There's no contract, and again, this is where lawyers kind of suck the fun out of the room. But I would say, it's a high risk concept that's going to exist on association property. You've contracted with this person, and as long as you're prepared for your insurance policy to be the one that's going to pay for any injury or damage to property, it's your business decision to make. But it's not always about the contract price, which is the driving factor behind what the contract term should say. It's obviously a cheap contract, but there's obviously a lot of risk. But I've also seen some contracts where, it might be a six-figure contract, but they're, I had a particular community that had cabins for rent, and they were just painting the doors of the cabins. But there were so many cabins that it was a six-figure contract. Not really a high-risk contract. They're just painting the exterior of doors, but there's a lot of money at stake. And so there might be some good reasons to have some insurance and some protections in there. So those are the things that I consider when someone says, do we need a contract, the dollar amount, and the risk factor. And then depending on the services that are provided, whether or not you'll need any of these coverages as part of it. I've touched a little bit on indemnification. The shift of liability, it's very important. You can have the best indemnification provision out there, shifting all the liability to the contractor. But guess what happens if that contractor doesn't have insurance? It comes back to you. So it's not just about making sure the indemnity shifts all the liability to the contractor, but making sure that contractor has insurance to pay when that lawsuit is triggered and the indemnity is triggered. So follow the money. The injured party is going to follow the money. And wherever the money exists, which is usually through an insurance policy, that's where the injured party, represented by one of these multiple lawyers you see on our billboards around town, that's where that injured party is going to go. Let's see here. A master service agreement is a great way to kind of help you make sure that you're getting the appropriate protections every time. It's essentially a template. I don't want to use the word template. That's not a fair representation, but it's a master service agreement that has all the key provisions covered: insurance, indemnity, default, right of termination, all those things I've been hammering on that I want to see for your benefit. Those are all drafted. And then the scope of work is whatever the contractor is going to do. Landscape the front, rebuild the pool, and that's attached as an exhibit to the master service agreement. So the scope of work that this contractor is going to provide for us is subject to the terms in the master service agreement. And anything that's contrary in the scope of work, contrary to the master service agreement controls. So it's a great tool that you don't necessarily have to pay a lawyer every time. Because I'll tell you a little bit of a secret. When I get someone's contract, a vendor's contract, all I try to do is make that contract look like my contract. That's all I do. And that's pretty much what every lawyer does. The master service agreement is my contract. And so with a little bit of an upfront cost, and I'm not the only game in town that does this, but with a little bit of upfront cost on the master service agreement, then you and your management company can just bid services, and you'll know you always got the right indemnity, you've always got the right insurance, you've always got the right default, notice of termination, etc. And so you don't have to pay your lawyer every time to make that vendor's contract look like what your lawyer's contract is. So like any relationship, periodic reviews are a good idea. Discuss performance issues, room for improvement. You'd be surprised at how many times when I hear an association kind of bring up concerns with regard to a vendor. Well, have you talked to the vendor yet? Well, not really. They should know that they're not providing good service. Well, let's kind of sit down with that particular vendor. Sometimes it takes some time to work your way up to a leadership position, someone that's actually going to listen to you. And discuss the performance issue. Maybe there needs to be a modification of a scope of the agreement. Maybe you were expecting the Cadillac, but you signed a contract for the Buick. And that kind of ties back into the significance of memorializing or knowing what you want up front and communicating that up front. The better communication there is up front, the more likely it is your expectations are going to align with the terms of the contract. Because oftentimes I see what the board is expecting to receive. It's just not in the contract. Or it's specifically excluded even. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Well, they should, and that's part of the interviewing process of the vendor. What are your quality controls, vendor, to make sure that you're regularly meeting the contract specifications? And, I always think it's a good idea for a board member maybe to be the contract person that is aware of every association contract. It's always good to know, when did it start? When is it supposed to end? When does it renew? Kind of have maybe build a spreadsheet that helps you track that. I'm sure there's some spreadsheet friendly folks in here. I'm not one of them. Excel makes my eyes cross. That's why I love my paralegal. She's awesome. But there's some things that you can build in on your end to make sure you're paying attention to the contracts, and then that puts you in a strong position to hold the vendor accountable if you ever need to. But most disputes, really kind of center on a misunderstanding as to what is supposed to be delivered. Sometimes it's just true, honest to God, bad service. Maybe they overextended themselves. But anyway, you kind of really can't figure that out unless you set yourself up for success on the front end. And then, as you pointed out, regular controls during the contract period. But oftentimes, Brady, we're getting bad service. We went out of this contract. Great. Send me a copy of the contract. Oh, we don't know where it is. That I get that a lot. So, I can help you get out of a contract, but I need to know. First, let's look at it. But let's see here. Okay, so that leaves me with one final segment here. And how much time do we have? So we've got an hour and 10 minutes. How about we start back up at 1 o'clock? Is that okay? Stretch your legs, get out of these wonderfully comfortable, flat elementary school kids' seats. Thank you. Thank you. I love the enthusiasm. Standard of care. So I've always hammer on this. If you take anything away from today, please let it be some of the content from this standard of care. We're in the home stretch. I'll try to get you out of here a little bit early if I can. But again, I'll definitely entertain your questions. So we'll cover what is standard of care, how to perform your duties without having any personal liability, and then also what are the risks associated with volunteering. This is the slide that if you circle one, highlight it, remember it, commit it to memory, this is the one that I would want you to do that with. Chapter 22 of the Business Organizations Code, specifically 22.221, the general standards for directors. You are not liable for actions that are taken in good faith, with ordinary care, and in a manner in which you reasonably believe to be in the best interest of the organization. If you remember these three things, kind of underpin all your decisions with these three elements, most often, or more often than not, you're not going to be held liable or personally liable when it comes to making decisions for the organization. And I'm going to focus a lot on personal liability here, but you as individual directors avoiding personal liability usually means that it's good for the entity too. So if you're satisfying these three requirements as directors, you're meeting the standard of care as an individual director. It's good for you as an individual, but it's also good for your entity as well. Those same elements exist for officers. So president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, the same requirements exist. Let me talk about ordinary care for a moment. What is the duty of ordinary care? Lawyers love to use these words and then, maybe not always explain what they mean. And so a good parallel or metaphor or example for me to use for you is a duty of ordinary care. All of us, when we get in our cars to leave today, are going to owe the exact same duty when it comes to operating that vehicle. Use our blinker, follow the speed limit, stop completely or almost completely at all stop signs. We all owe that duty of ordinary care, all of us equally. I often hear directors say, we have a fiduciary duty to our members. I'm going to respectfully correct you in that regard and tell you that you do not have a fiduciary duty to your members. The reason why that's important is a fiduciary duty is a duty of extraordinary care. It's a higher standard of care. As legal counsel for associations, as a lawyer, I owe a fiduciary duty to my clients. So I have, the duty of utmost care. It's a duty of extraordinary care. The reason that I will tell you not to publicly say to your community or put it in your newsletter or put it on your website, you had all those things happen, the law says you only have a duty of ordinary care. But if you announce it publicly that you have a fiduciary duty, you've just elevated the standard of care so that you're now subject to that higher level of care. I represented an association that was sued for violation of breach of fiduciary duty. The individual directors were sued for breach of fiduciary duty. We attempted to get that cause of action dismissed from the lawsuit, and we cited this provision right here. Well, Your Honor, they don't have a fiduciary duty. So they don't have a fiduciary duty, they sure as heck can't breach it. So kick this cause of action. Plaintiff's counsel, or the owner's counsel, came back and provided examples of newsletters, mass emails. It was on the website even, where the board was putting out content saying that they owed a fiduciary duty to the members. So the court said, yeah, we understand what Business Organizations Code says, but you've announced yourself as having a fiduciary duty, so now your standard of care is elevated. So respectfully, I'll just recommend that you remove that word fiduciary from your vocabulary when you're addressing the members. Now, you do have a fiduciary duty to the organization. So that's important. That's an important distinction. And when it comes to managing money that comes from someone else, there's an inherent fiduciary duty that comes with that. But you don't necessarily need to make public statements in that regard, and it's very easy to confuse your membership. So act like you have a fiduciary duty all day long. That's great. Just don't publicly say that you have a fiduciary duty over your members. So, because you're ultimately raising the standard of care in an area where you don't have to. Good faith. A way to satisfy the element of good faith is to rely on the advice of experts. You've heard me touch on this already, but here's just kind of a quick list of potential experts for your community: manager, legal counsel, CPA, investment banker, landscape architect, engineer. And I impress upon boards to don't be afraid to use association money to engage experts to help you make a good decision. If you are engaging an expert to help you make a decision and you rely on that expert's written advice, that's a liability shield for the organization. That's a liability shield for you as an individual director. The hypothetical I always give here: hailstorm, the damage, or there may have been damage to the recreation center in the common area. You all as individuals, get out in the parking lot, you stand on your tiptoes, you look at the roof, you say, you know what, the roof looks fine from here. We didn't have any water leaks. I don't see any water spots on the sheetrock. Heck, I've owned a roofing company for 20 years. I did roofing in high school, me personally. I think that roof is fine. Well, the next deluge comes, and let's say that the roof fails, and your ceiling in your rec center just collapses. You know who you're going to hear from. You're going to hear from your members. How did this happen? Yes. Why didn't you have the roof inspected after that hailstorm? Why didn't you bring in a roofing inspector? Well, I did roofing for in high school, and I own a roofing company, so I didn't think we needed to. If I'm the individual director and I just said that, I just put my own personal liability at stake. The decision as to whether or not to bring in a roofing inspector after the hailstorm was made by me instead of by a roofing expert. So let me flip the script on you. And let's say that we brought out a roofing expert. That expert looked at the roof after the hailstorm, and that person said, everything looks fine. Here's your written report. You don't need to submit an insurance claim. This roof is bulletproof, and it fared the hailstorm well. Well, even if the deluge comes and causes your ceiling to collapse, you now have an answer as to why you didn't replace the roof after the hailstorm. It's because the expert told us not to. Also, using an expert to help you make your decisions also helps you communicate the why to your community. Let's say you do replace the roof after that hailstorm, and that's going to cost you $100,000 to do it. There's going to be someone in the community that's going to say, why are we spending this money? Ideally, it will be covered by insurance, but let me kind of just put that to the side for the purpose of this hypothetical. You're spending $100,000 to repair a roof after a hailstorm. Why are you spending our money? Why are you doing this? If you have an expert report that says, well, this person says our roof needs to be replaced, this is why we're replacing it, we're engaging the advice of an expert, and this is what they're telling us to do. So it's a great communication tool. It's a great liability shield, and it also kind of beats back those homeowners that are inevitably going to challenge every decision that you make or don't make. Every dollar that you spend or don't spend, someone out there has an opposing opinion on it. And so using your experts to help you make those decisions is a great way to address those stories that you read on social media, perhaps, whether it's Nextdoor or the unofficial Facebook page that you have. So that, again, close with, don't be afraid to spend a little bit of money with your experts to get you that protection, especially if it's a big ticket item for your community. Why are we making this decision? Why are we spending this money? Why aren't we spending this money? And maybe this is a good point to mention reserve studies. Anybody know, or does anybody not know what a reserve study is? Oh, okay. So what a reserve study is, an expert that comes in and looks at your community assets, your improvements, your rec center, your swimming pool, your park, your walking trails, your gate, signage, whatever it may be. And that expert kind of measures the average lifespan for an improvement like that and the costs that come along with the maintenance of that. And helps you come up with a mechanism to fund or reserve fund for regular maintenance of those improvements or eventual replacement. So if you have big ticket improvements in your community, a reserve study is a good idea. And I'll reference the reserve study specifically because it's a useful tool in communicating to your membership as to why you need to set assessments at a certain rate. It's not you as directors just picking a number. You've got the budget, you have this reserve study that says you should be socking away $50 a household per year for the next 20 years, whatever it may be, to fund the eventual replacement of this improvement. When I hear a board say, we haven't raised assessments in 10 years, bravo, that there's a problem because the cost of everything has gone up in the last 10 years. And in particular, if you have a big ticket improvement, a rec center, a swimming pool, walking trails, park equipment, you may be underfunded when it comes time to maintain those or replace those. And I deal a lot in community disputes where there is aging improvements on common areas, parks, playgrounds. You're going to hear from a very vocal group that use that and that consider it tied to their property values if that starts to deteriorate. It does affect the marketability of your community. So in response to those that are going to challenge you for spending money to redo the playground or redo the rec center, redo the pool, the reserve study will help you fund money today for the cost of that tomorrow. The recommended interval on reserve studies, I'm going to punt to your reserve study expert, and it may be tied to the type of improvements that you have. But I'll just kind of stop there. But I've seen them. I'll stop there. But yeah, there are a few companies that do them. Reserve Advisors is one. I think there are members of CAI. Maybe Jesus knows the other one. So there's Reserve Advisors and Association Reserves. There may be other companies out there, but those are business partners in CAI, and they're the experts that you would engage for this kind of thing. Sometimes there's an engineering component to it as well, and so there's certifications that come with what they're doing. And again, for that homeowner that wants the assessments to stay the same level forever, or even better, wants a refund check for all equivalent to all the money that's in your reserve account split by the number of lots. I've heard that one before. That's a great tool to help you fund your entity and your budget, set your budget. Let's see, I've covered that. So you've heard me talk about the standard of care, the difference between ordinary care and extraordinary care, ordinary duty versus fiduciary duty. Know that as volunteers, what exists for you in the state law and federal law is a concept called immunity. And this comes out of the 80s, I believe. There was a huge drain in nonprofit director volunteers. And it's because those nonprofit directors were being sued individually, and there were no immunity protections in the law. Well, if your personal bank accounts and your assets were subject to individual liability based on the decisions you made as an unpaid volunteer for an organization, who would want to volunteer for that? And so in order to make sure that nonprofit boards, there were individuals that raised their hand to serve, both Texas and the federal law put forth these acts. This particular one here is the Charitable Immunity Act, Charitable Immunity and Liability Act of '87. This is Texas's statute. And you'll see the underlined words here. A volunteer serving as a director officer is immune from civil liability. This means when you see your name, or if you see your name in that lawsuit, you are immune from civil liability for any acts or omissions that result in death, damage, or injury if you're acting in the course and scope of your duties or functions as a director. So this is where I'm going to give you a visual and draw you a box. How do we stay within our scope of authority? How do we make sure we're acting within the course and scope of our authority? Part of that, hammering on, what I hammered on, relying on the advice of your experts. The other part of that, let's follow our governing documents. Follow the law. And, you're not going to be, just by virtue of volunteering and being elected, you're not going to know everything all at once automatically. And that's how your experts can help you stay within that scope of authority. When I'll probably cover rogue directors a little bit more, but whenever I hear a director say, I appreciate your legal advice, Brady, but, I'm going to do whatever I want, that director just took steps away from the volunteer immunity protection. Ignoring the advice of an expert or running afoul to that advice could mean that volunteer immunity is lost. Whoops. I'm sorry, I should have had this up on the screen. The underlined portion is really the significant aspects of this statute. You're immune from civil liability if you're acting within the course and scope of your duties. So it doesn't apply to intentional, willful, or wantonly negligent behavior, or if you're acting with conscious indifference or reckless disregard for the safety of others. That's that, thanks Brady, but no thanks. I'm going to do whatever I want. So as I tell directors, it's great that you may have joined an organization because you have a mission, you have a goal, you have something you want to accomplish, and maybe it's something personal to you. But know that the best interest of the organization is going to be paramount to whatever your individual goal may be. The example I give here is maybe there's a fence restriction that you don't agree with. You applied for a fence, your fence application was denied, you don't agree with it, and you join the board because you want your fence. that happens all the time. Not necessarily anything wrong with that, as long as it's a broader scope, right? So if it's just that, I want my fence and I'm going to get on the board and I'm going to shove this thing through and make sure I get the fence I want. That's probably someone who's acting outside the standard of care, outside their scope of authority. Now, if that very same individual joins and says, you know what, I don't agree with our fence restrictions. I don't agree with our fence guidelines. I think our community would benefit if we change them. And I'm joining the board to see what I can do to change the fence guidelines for the benefit of the whole community. That's a different approach, a different philosophy, and that's more likely within the boundaries of that standard of care. So, note this exclusion here. Those volunteer immunity protections do not apply to a charitable organization. That's your HOA is considered a charitable organization. They do not apply to an organization that does not have liability insurance coverage. And here's those coverage amounts that you asked about earlier. And so in order to obtain the benefits of volunteer immunity, you have to have insurance coverage with at least these parameters here. So it's $1 million for a single occurrence, and then $500 for each person. So that's the question that I asked. If anyone said, we want you to serve on the board of directors, Brady, I would say, do you have directors and officers insurance coverage? And that leads to me having volunteer immunity if I do volunteer to serve and stay within the course and scope of my authority. So here's a little bit on the federal act. You don't necessarily need to memorize the difference between state and federal, but just know that both, wherever there's a gap in one, it's made up by the other. But I like to present both statutes because to me, it took our federal government a little bit longer, just 10 years, to come up with the Volunteer Protection Act of '97, but you end with pretty much the same protection. So no volunteer of a nonprofit organization shall be liable for harm caused by an act or omission of the volunteer if the volunteer was acting within the scope of the volunteer's responsibilities. There's that word scope again. And the harm was not caused by willful or criminal misconduct, gross negligence, reckless misconduct, or conscious flagrant indifference to the rights or safety of others. Again, that's the person that says, I appreciate your legal advice, Brady, but I'm going to do whatever I want. That's someone who's acting willfully and ignoring the advice of experts. And the advice of experts can be any of those that I mentioned on that slide. So it's very important that if someone's telling you not to do something or to do something, to make sure that you heed that when it comes to your decision making, as you could be taking steps away from this volunteer immunity concept. Here's some other exceptions. Don't apply to crime, violence, or an act of terrorism. Some of this is self-explanatory. Hate crimes, sexual offenses, state or federal civil rights laws. And then I always call out the last one, where the defendant was under intoxication of drugs or alcohol. Occasionally, I have board members that have a Yeti at a board meeting, and I know it's not full of water or coffee or soda, and just so I kind of call it out that if, and I've had some say to me, we appreciate your advice, Brady, but this is the way we get through our directors' meetings, which I suppose I get. But it's my job to present what my legal advice is and what the risks are for not following it. But the doomsday scenario for you, right? Let's talk about that. You make a decision as a board and someone is there and they know that you have something fun in your Yeti. You bet that's going to be called out as the basis for that. And that could ultimately lead to the loss of volunteer immunity if they sue you individually. Brady made the decision as a director and he had something in his Yeti that made him intoxicated, and therefore Brady is not covered by insurance. So be careful. Enjoy the libations after the meeting adjourns. I'm okay with that. You're outside the scope of the meeting. So we're making some good time here. Tying the standard of care and volunteer immunity to your insurance coverage. And I'll kind of expand a little bit more on the rogue director, and even more so these days, the rogue ACC member. That's something I've had to deal with a lot because now boards and ACC should be separate individuals. And so I'm giving these same speeches, not just to directors now, but to also ACC committee members. So behavior that is outside the standard of care may lead to a loss of coverage. Speaking to insurance policies generally, your insurance policies are going to have specific provisions of exclusion. Everything's covered unless it's one of these exclusions. Everything that's covered is in large print. Everything that's excluded is in small print. And no, I can't speak to every single director and officer insurance policy, but I would hazard a guess that most of them have an exclusion for a breach of the standard of care or a breach of the duty of good faith. And so the way I use that when I'm speaking with a rogue director or even a rogue ACC member is know that the insurance policy is there to cover you if you're named individually in a lawsuit. But if it's determined that you are breaching the standard of care, you may not be entitled to volunteer immunity, and that breach of standard of care may be specifically excluded under the insurance policy. And when I'm trying to really rein that director in, is all I want the director to do is follow the law and the governing documents. And when I really want to rein him in, I'll say, I hope you have $50,000 in the bank to defend yourself, because that's about how much it costs to defend a lawsuit today in attorney fees. And if you're going to say thanks but no thanks to my legal advice, you better start saving some money, because the insurance coverage may not kick in to cover you. It's a pretty rough, speech, and it's really only for the worst case scenarios, but it does become important when someone wants to do whatever they want, and I'll tie it into an example with an ACC. I had an ACC member. Let me back up. In the declaration, there was a very specific prohibition against black metal roofs. No one really knows why. It was just in there. No black, red, or blue metal roofs. I don't know that I've ever seen a red or blue metal roof, but anyway, it was in the declaration. And I think black metal roofs have become somewhat trendy or, aesthetically the thing to do. And the ACC chair said, you know what, I don't care what our declaration says. I'm going to approve these because I think they look great. And that ACC member pushed forth probably 3 approvals of black metal roofs in a custom build community, just completely contrary to what the declaration said. And so I had an orientation with the ACC, and I said, look, you have to follow your governing documents to the best of your ability, whether you agree with them or not. That's always going to be my advice. Sometimes you inherit provisions that don't make any sense. I was having a conversation with someone in the back previously that sometimes what the developer does is they take the set of documents that worked for ABC community, cross out ABC, and they put XYZ community, and that's the set of documents that they have for the new one. So sometimes your governing documents don't make sense for your community. But nonetheless, my advice is always going to be, do the best you can to follow your governing documents, whether you agree with them or not. And if you don't agree with them and you think you can get support in the community, well then amend them. Yeah. And I told that to the ACC chair. If you want black metal roofs in the community, so be it. I don't care. Just go through the amendment process to change it. There's a process to get into the documents what you want. But we had the come to Jesus session, so to speak, and, you know, that ACC chair member resigned after that because I think he realized the risk that he was taking on by pushing forth whatever he wanted in the community, which was contrary to the terms of the declaration. So, not a place that I always enjoy going as the attorney, but it's definitely a place that needs to be traveled to if someone is acting unilaterally outside the vote of the majority or acting contrary to the governing documents. So all of this to be said, that if you're following those three elements, ordinary care, good faith, in the best interest of the community or the association, and you're doing the best you can to follow the governing documents, you're relying on your experts when you need to help you make decisions, more often than not, you're going to stay within the boundaries of the standard of care, and you're going to keep that volunteer immunity. Your personal assets are going to be safe. You're not going to have to save $50,000 in the bank to defend a claim. And, you know, in the event that you do get named individually, the directors and officers' insurance is going to cover you. So that's the significance of standard of care, volunteer immunity, and insurance tied together. Any questions on that? Everybody ready to head out? Well, thank you very much for your attention today. I appreciate all the questions, and you know, if you have any questions about CAI as an organization, I think you have my contact information. You have Jesus's contact information. I definitely want to thank the city of Cibolo for giving us the opportunity to educate you. I look forward to the next roundtable, and maybe I'll ask real quick, what if you all kind of think about or want to throw out some topics that you think would be good for the next session. Okay. 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 I like that. Or, I mean, I like that idea. I don't like that it's happening. But some ideas have already run across my mind in terms of what you could do to publicly put it out there as much as you can, that it's your community's pool, not anyone else's. Maybe we'll talk after this a little bit more, but part of it to me is putting something on your website, maybe find a way to make it public record so that it comes up not just in your title, but their title. And then also making sure whoever you can speak with at the developer is aware that those documents exist. But longer conversation, but good idea. Yes, ma'am. Yes, that's in a series in the future, but yes.
Social media, I've heard two things. Stay off social
So I always quote Will Rogers here. When it comes to social media, even if you're on the right track, if you stand still, you'll get run over. And so with social media, you definitely have to keep moving. And I have a social media strategies, some content that we can address that, how to use it, how not to use it, and how to make sure that people that are looking for information go to the correct places. Because next door is not, is not the correct place. It's not official, nor is the unofficial Facebook page that somebody created about the community long ago that no one really has the password that's on the board. But anyway, I don't want to spoil it. But yeah, there's plenty of content on social media as well.
How to, let's say you do start switching management companies, and we don't have a Federal Ranch website. We have a portal that's only accessible through our management. So if we leave our management ever, what happens to all of our stuff? Where does it go? So how do we preserve our information long term? Because we can't print everything and put it in a little box and store the box.
Right.
Just what thoughts and ideas are there? Should we have our own Federal Grant website that we pay forever and eternally? Or there's just some stuff there when we're moving management and buying our computer information
Okay.
for the next person that comes on the board to know where to go.
Okay. So financials, when it comes to management, holding a management company accountable, record keeping, social media. Oh, Jesus, thank you. Developers.
To make sure we captured it all, so if Jesus
Yeah.
is typing it, Brian Huggins is typing it, we're gonna repeat all the topics you bring up.
Okay. That's a good one. That's a
And
good
then
one.
way to count your 90 and 120 days and foreclosure versus liens versus knowing kind of where you should be at with some of that.
Okay, so collections
Yeah,
in general? Okay. Right. Specifically around credit reporting, which was last session, and then filing liens, which was this session. I don't think it's effective yet, but I think it will be September 1st. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Brian, do you wanna do your best to restate all those ideas so that we know we captured them? And Jesus, if you have something that Brian doesn't say, and then for anyone who brought a topic up, if you did not capture it, remind them. Okay? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, that's
Jennifer had the first item, and your topic was,
Property management companies, just knowing where our rights as board members, homeowners, not being their goes over, taking advantage of. If someone else is talking about like standard fees that we should be looking for, contracts, understanding, because every management company we've ever interviewed has totally different ideas of fee structure, contracts, duties, etc.
and Jennifer, I think a topic that you brought up was who owns the HOA document? Because if you leave an HOA management company, how do you get them?
Yeah, so
Is
record
that,
keeping.
is that something that you can
Well,
help
the record
HOAs with?
keeping, like how do we, how does that follow us and not stay with that management company? Because you actually were our attorney for a split second. So
I remember.
documents from Plateau and that issue, nothing really
should be in your contract. Most management contracts have a provision regarding the transition of books and records upon termination.
Well, everybody's saying, I don't know anything, and that's, so I just don't wanna have that happen again.
Yeah, so your struggle from plateau to AMG,
It's probably
There's a-
rare, I hope it's rare, I hope it's not something that happens again.
it is
but
rare, and what you're struggling with
we lost
is
history.
endemic to that particular circumstance, but it's definitely good content for everyone to be aware that if you were to transition a management company, how can, as you as a director, can make sure that records are going from A to B. The plateau experience would just be unfortunately unique. That company just,
Well, but
so
it's,
We'll cover that in a future workshop.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
In more detail. And then the second topic was how do you track, not track financial data, but financial related.
we have budget workshops would be helpful, because they kind of throw that on us, and we sit there and go, oh.
Okay, and then once Brian's done typing that up, we'll cover the other topics that y'all brought up. Here's another suggestion. We, at the next workshop, be happy to tell you how we are trying to catch up on road maintenance versus the history that this has had. To be transparent, right? We've not done a good job. But I can tell you the council members who are here today and the rest of the council are getting laser focused on recognizing the need to have money, millions of dollars annually set aside just to maintain things. Thank you, sir. Yes? Okay.
The umbrella, the kind of Texas property code, we were talking about that, Texas property code for city versus HOA, who's trumps who? Like, how do we know if the city says it's okay to park on the street, your HOA bylaws say it's not okay to park on the street, like, where do we know
Okay.
who, yeah.
We'll answer that in a good council. Brings up a question.
it does.
So to wrap up, I just want Chief Wells to talk about two things very quickly. Before we have this workshop, the idea of a neighborhood-specific neighborhood watch program has been mentioned, and so I want Chief Wells just to share with you some information about that, and that if a neighborhood is interested, how can we be of assistance to you? And the second is security in our neighborhoods. Just like you, I live in a neighborhood here. I was my president. And sometimes bad things happen in our neighborhood, so he's just going to share with you what one neighborhood is already doing. And if there's an interest, more information at the next workshop could be shared.
Right.
Chief?
Thank you, Mr. Reed. Okay, so again, I know we talked a lot earlier about the strategic plan City Council has put forward, like what their priorities want to be, and I have 3 council members here who can attest to that. But One of those was, how do we enhance our neighborhood watch program throughout the community? So that's listed as one of their goals that they would like to see us and see the community do, is get more neighborhood watches out there. So that is a function the police department directly helps out with. We are here as a resource. Our mission statement is to provide professional law enforcement services while enforcing the law and fostering positive community partnerships. So that last part is why we're here today, and we take that to heart. We have over 20 programs that we do out in the community, everything from our Citizens Police Academy to our Junior Police Academy, Blue Santa program, and Neighborhood Watches falls under one of those, under that umbrella as well. So we have 2 employees that are dedicated in our crime prevention unit. We have Officer Matt Shima, who's one of our police officers. That's a duty that he does as a police officer for the community. And then Mr. Rick Morellis is a civilian employee who works in that unit as well. And so either one of them is a resource to y'all to do that. All we ask is the chance to come in and talk to your board, or talk to y'all eventually, individually, maybe meet with the president, but ideally to meet with the board or during one of your meetings to do a presentation on what it takes to set up a neighborhood watch and have your block captains and things like that, so that we can enhance that partnership. So we've got y'all's contact information. If you would like to reach out to either one of them individually, we have just a generic email address for our crime prevention unit. It's CPU, so Crime Prevention Unit, cpu@cibolo.tx.gov. And what I'm going to do is to kind of be proactive. I'm going to take y'all's contact info and pass it on to them as well, and maybe just have them send a follow-up email saying, hey, this is who we are. This is what we'd like to do. We'd like to come in and just give you a presentation on neighborhood watches and what those steps do take. It is something we partner with you with, but it does take the neighborhood to kind of, there's some work that involves the neighborhood with getting your, we talked about some subcommittees earlier and things like that. I've seen some neighborhoods have, like a neighborhood watch subcommittee. They elect their block captains who help coordinate things. The block captains then kind of become a liaison between the police department and the neighborhood. So if the neighborhood has any kind of issues or concerns that they want to bring up, they get with their block captain. The block captain has a direct contact, which would probably be Mr. Morellis or Officer Shima. Send them an email, send them a phone call, say, hey, we've got a concern in our neighborhood. How's the best way that we can handle this? Or can you pass it on to our officers? What do you suggest? And then also, it gives us a chance to communicate directly with somebody in the neighborhood who can set up different crime prevention programs that we have. We can come out and do an Operation ID where we help to engrave some of your high-value items and get those logs. So if they're stolen, it's easier. There's all these different other programs that tie back into that. So hopefully, like I said, we can start establishing some of those partnerships. I'd also like at a follow-up meeting to maybe bring Officer Shima and Mr. Morellis in, have them do a more formal, lengthy presentation about what that involves and how we can partner. Just that way we have all the information. So the second part of that is some of the success story that Mr. Reed mentioned. So, and I think I've had a couple of conversations today. I know Jennifer and I talked a little bit earlier about what neighborhoods can do. Everybody's got their own security cameras around neighborhoods or at their homes. We got Ring. We got all these different types of companies that everybody does for home security. So those are great. We have a program where you can actually call down to the police department, let us know you have that camera. If we have something going on in your neighborhood, we come knock on your door and say, hey, down the street, they had a vehicle broken into. Can we take a look at your camera footage and see if we caught any kind of activity going on? It's totally voluntary. You can say no, and we'll say, hey, thank you, no problem. We don't access your stuff without your permission. Or we just give you an email address that, hey, if you look through your cameras and you find something, can you send us that footage via email so that we can have that evidence? It's very important. So unfortunately, a lot of times, most of those Ring cameras will capture a vehicle, but for instance, referencing one of the neighborhoods that I'm going to talk about in a second, back in October, the Lantana subdivision had some vehicle burglaries that happened. 2 different incidents. One night it was a white Ring camera caught a black sedan, 4-door sedan. That's really all we could tell off of the camera because it was at night. Didn't have any license plates, didn't have any other kind of description, but other than that. A few weeks later, they got hit again. This was a white Ford cargo van. That's all we could tell. It was a large van. So that is great evidence, but it doesn't give us a lot to go on as a police department unless we can tie that back into something else. But Lantana has a system called Flock Safety at their entrance, which is a license plate reader camera system. The neighborhood pays for it themselves. They own the data that's there. It gets uploaded into the cloud, and basically that captures every vehicle that comes in and out of their neighborhood. They have 2 cameras, one going in, one going out. You can use the system with only 1 camera. You don't have to have 2. So what we did is we then reached out to the HOA. I think their treasurer kind of monitors that, and said, hey, we had these incidents, can you look through your system and see what you have? He was able to find a black BMW that was in the neighborhood that night with a license plate, and a white Ford cargo van on the other incident with a license plate for us as well, and gave that information back to us. So we consider that a big success because we don't normally get that kind of information. So I believe, is there any of the neighborhoods using ALPR systems? I thought Jesus said somebody mentioned. Are you in Lantana, sir? Which neighborhood are you in? Deer Meadows, okay. Are y'all using Flock? Okay, that's great. I wasn't aware of that. So what Flock does for law enforcement then is they run a database nationwide, and we actually, Cibolo PD is already a member of it. We can log in anytime, and I can run any kind of license plate or vehicle description. And as long as we subscribe to those cameras, which we subscribe to most of them in the state of Texas and several nationwide, it gives us any kind of a reading on where that vehicle's been seen in the last 30 days. So the vehicle may have been in y'all's neighborhood doing a crime, but then also may have been picked up somewhere in San Antonio, San Marcos. There's other agencies around here or cities that are starting to implement and install the Flock camera systems as well. So they're very heavily used up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Arlington's got a ton of them, for example. Over in the Houston area, some of the communities over there use them, and they've got a lot of success stories. So the city, we've talked about implementing some of them as a city, but they also allow commercial businesses and the communities to partner with them as well. So, and again, it's kind of privately owned. So I would like to bring in Marcus Upchurch eventually, who is their community affairs manager, and he can do a more in-depth presentation. But if you just go to flocksafety.com, that's their website, and it kind of shows what the camera looks like. The neighborhood pays a subscription fee. I believe it's about $3,500 a year, but it's 100%. They maintain them. If the system goes down, it's not working, they know it's completely hands-off for the neighborhood itself. So, and again, we've got a couple of them and it's worked out well for y'all's neighborhood. How long have y'all been using them? 6 months? Okay. See, so what I need to do is reach out to Flock and let them know that y'all have them as well, and make sure that we're subscribed to y'all's cameras, because if we get anything in your neighborhood, that's the first place our officers will go, is to look for any suspicious vehicles that have come in and out. So it's a huge resource for us. We hope to enhance more of those partnerships as we move on. Anybody have any questions about that? Yes, sir. No, neither one of them are. And you can drive by Lantana and you can actually see they've got theirs. They're mounted on a pole. You can see they've got a small solar panel on the top. And the camera itself is just a little bit larger than like a game camera you would see for sale at Academy or something like that. So it works off an LTE signal, so every car that goes by, the data automatically gets updated to their cloud. And like I said, any of our officers, we can, as law enforcement, we can go in and put stolen vehicle alerts. So if a vehicle gets stolen here in Cibolo, we can put that information in. If it's somebody in this room, could be their vehicle. And any cameras that vehicle goes past nationwide, we could get an alert saying it's stolen, as well as the local law enforcement agency where that camera is located would get that alert saying, hey, there's a stolen vehicle out of Cibolo that just drove past a camera in this neighborhood or this parking lot or on the side of this street. And they've been a lot of success in neighborhoods about recovering stolen vehicles. The city of Jersey Village over in the Houston area, they installed a bunch around the city, and within 6 months they'd recovered $1 million worth of stolen vehicles just from the cameras themselves. So just because they're constantly reading those plates. So FLOCK, like a flock of seagulls. So flocksafety.com is there. And there are other companies out there. I'm not here to specifically endorse a specific company. They just have a really, really good relationship with law enforcement. They are unique that they let us access the data without having to bother anybody in the HOA and say, hey, can you go watch and see what you have? We can go in there and do the queries ourselves. As well as, for example, with Lantana, with having the black four-door sedan, we didn't have a license plate to search. But we can use that as a parameter between these hours, because we have the Ring camera. I think it was about 3:30 in the morning. During, from midnight to 5 a.m., how many black four-door sedans drove past y'all's entrance or their entrance, and figure out how many there are. So, and find out if they live in the neighborhood or not. So it gives us those abilities to search by vehicle description as well, not just by license plate. So, ma'am, did you have a question over here? So they recommend at least one, and yes, they're going to recommend that you have each entry point covered. That way, whether they're coming or going, they have to come in, they have to eventually go out, but everybody has to come in. So at the very least, you'd get a reading off of one of the entrances. So, and again, I know that doesn't sound super cost effective. If it's 3,000 to 3,500, I believe, per year, per camera. But that's less than, you think about it's less than $10 a day, you know, which you wouldn't pay that for a security company or somebody to be out there watching, and they're watching 24/7, 365, monitoring every vehicle that comes in and out of the neighborhood. So. Exactly. Yes, sir. That would be our ultimate goal as a city, as a police department, is if we had them in the neighborhoods, we're able to implement them as a city in some of our streets so that we're actually able to track them around. We could put some on Cibolo Valley Drive, Green Valley, things like that. And we'd have a perimeter network or a network throughout the city where we could track wherever vehicles are being seen. And again, enhance our chances of getting those type of alerts if it's a stolen car or if it's something we're watching for another reason. So. Mhm. Okay. Mhm. Right. Oh, valid point. Okay, very valid point. And we have started some of those things. They've looked at the city itself, and as far as a city, if we were going to implement a program and what those phases look like, we have started speaking about what they've looked at our streets and said, these are the highly traveled areas, so we would recommend starting here and putting cameras on these streets, and then in phase 2, we can go to some of the other more side streets, but really it does create almost a net all the way around Cibolo eventually, where no one could go in and out really without having their license plate captured. So, and that he would expand more. They've got some things built in about privacy. They don't capture the front of the vehicle. That way it's not taking a picture of you driving your car or whoever's driving. They always set the cameras up to catch the back license plate. Plus a lot of vehicles sometimes don't have a front license plate, even though you're required. Everybody has one on the back. So they always get questions about privacy concerns and things like that. Any kind of the pictures they keep only stay in their system for 30 days. So they have some things built that he would eventually expand on that I've seen. So, but.
One last question, Jason was raising his hand.
Yes, Jason. Right. Not around here, but I do know there are some. Like when we're able to look at the map, and we have a map that we have in our portal that shows where cameras are located within communities, and I have seen some in other cities where, like again, around the Houston, Dallas area, where they do have them at every one of their entrances. So the city of White Settlement up in the Fort Worth area, they have a really big flock safety program, and they promote it very heavily. You can go to their social media, and they talk about the success stories they have using flock and their partnership they have with the community and their system. So again, okay. And see, some of those are the side streets that we would look at eventually if we were to do a citywide type network, where we'd try to have those covered, the main thoroughfares, so that, you know, we, again, not only is it happening in the neighborhood, but what's happening in the other areas as well. So.
All right, just to respect everyone's time, 2 more things. I'd really love if y'all would be open to this, to have Jesus and Brady come up here with our council members and all of you. Let's get a picture up here of everyone who was here. I'd love to do that. And then Jennifer here was asking earlier, hey, Wayne, can I get the contact information of everybody who came here? And I told her, I only got your name and your neighborhood. The chief was also saying that we could use your contact information to send you more information about our crime prevention unit. So I'll say this, the sign-in sheets are on the back table. If you want to leave an email address, just flip it over and put your contact email there, and we will use that contact information as the chief said. Oh, you got a list. Oh, good. Okay. Okay, so if you did not register through the CAI portal, then leave your email back there. We'll combine the 2.